My name is Erica Nunkinis, and I am the Harry Ransom Center Associate Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs. And thank you for coming out tonight. There was a lot of traffic out there, we heard, so all of you are very much appreciated. And of course, I'm delighted to welcome you this evening for the Dean Echenberg Poetry Series, celebrating war, literature, and the arts, graciously funded by Dean Echenberg. Thank you very much for being here and supporting this series. This is our second annual poetry series here at the Ransom Center, so look forward to many more. This past year, especially today on Veterans Day, we reflect on and commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War in all of its many facets. Today we are joined by two very special guests whose poetic works offer a glimpse into the war's lasting impact and ongoing legacy. Deborah Paredez and Hai-Dang Phan will read from selections of their poetry collections, sharing both their complementary and contrasting personal perspectives on this complex legacy. Following their readings, Deborah and Hai-Dang will engage in a conversation about their work with a Q&A session from our audience. So we invite you to stay and ask questions and reflect with us. We also invite you after tonight's program for a reception where you can also purchase copies of Deborah and Hai-Dang's work out in the lobby. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. Hai-Dang Phan is a poet, translator, and essayist, and the author of the poetry collections Reenactment in 2019, and in 2020, the translator of Phan Yen Hao's selected volume of poems, Paper Bells. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the 2016 Best American Poetry, New England Review, The New Yorker, Poetry, Bennington Review, and many others. He is also the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Breadloaf Winners Conference, and the American Literary Translators Association, An avid bird watcher, he is currently working on a book of literary nonfiction called Operation Laughing Thrush, which we have to know more about the entangled life histories of humans and birds, the conservation ethics in Vietnam, and a Vietnam American's writer's search for belonging. Phan has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop and is currently Associate Professor of English at Grinnell College. Deborah Paredez is certainly perhaps familiar to some of us here at UT, where she taught for many years, but now she is Associate Professor and Chair of the Creative Writing Program at Columbia University. She is the author of 4 books: the critical memoir American Diva, Extraordinary, Unruly, and Fabulous in 2024, the scholarly study Salinidad, Salina, Latinos, and the Performance of Memory in 2009, and 2 poetry collections, This Side of Skin in 2002, and then jumping forward in time, The Year of the Dog in 2020, winner of the Writers League of Texas Poetry Book Award, and a New York Times New and Notable Book Award. Her poetry and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Boston Review of Poetry, and elsewhere. In 2019, she was also the co-founder of Canto Mundo in San Antonio, the national organization dedicated to Latinx poets and poetry. So with those 2 introductions, please help me in welcoming Deborah and Hai-Dang. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. All right, it's such a pleasure to be back at UT Austin, and especially at the Ransom Center, which is known all over the world for the amazing work that you all do here. So thank you for having me back. It's a wonderful way to return, and thanks to Erica and everyone here for making this such a lovely and welcome return. I'm just gonna show a few images. My book, Year of the Dog, is a book of poetry that relies heavily on and incorporates photographs. And I will show some of them in a bit here. But first, I'll just tell a little bit about the title. Year of the Dog in this book refers to a couple of different things, the first of which is the lunar calendar, obviously, but in particular the year 1970, the year of the metal dog in the lunar calendar, which was the year I was born and the year my father was prepared. He'd been drafted and was getting ready to deploy to Vietnam. And it is also referring to, as you'll see in some of the poems, the figure of Hecuba. Many of you may recall from your readings of the Greeks, the figure who was the queen of Troy, who upon her capture by the Greeks after Troy fell, she was being taken along with all the other women to be slaves to the Greeks, and she wouldn't shut up about how absolutely horrified she was by war. She howled and howled and howled on the ship back to Greece, howled so much that she turned into a dog and leapt to her freedom from captivity to be on an island in the middle of the ocean, howling for the rest of her days. So for me, she symbolizes that sort of feminine figure that is literally transformed because of her commitment to outcry against the war. So just to give you some background on that. So many of you may recognize some of these photos. To think about Vietnam is, I think, in many ways to be absolutely bombarded in our mind's eye with the photographs from that era. It was the first war that we sort of talk about being, wherein photography played a very central role in that moment and in the sort of surrounding events about it. And so for me, to reckon with Vietnam was to reckon with not only my own personal memories I had through my father, but through a kind of national memory, right? The sort of memory that is absolutely in some ways overdetermined in many ways by this amazing archive of photos. And so I incorporate some of these in ways you'll see soon with another archive. And that is the photographs and snapshots my father took in Vietnam while he was there. Some of these photos you'll see are of people. Many of those photos were also of landscapes. And I incorporate as well the captions on the back as a way to also have the traces of his own body in the book with me. And so I am interested in putting one archive, right, sort of up against another to see what happens. And in my book, that sometimes means collage, in which the photos sometimes butt up against each other or resonate with each other. Or rhyme visually as a way to think through what it means to reckon with both the memory of Vietnam and its after lives. So I'm going to read a few poems. And what I'll do while I'm reading is show some of the images that are sort of in either the opposing page of the poem or perhaps the page right before or right after. The first poem I'll read is called Wife's Disaster Manual, and it takes from another mythic figure, not Hecuba, but a very famous wife, Lot's wife, in the Bible, and I ask what happens if actually we think about her turning around not because she was full of avarice about the things she lost, but maybe was turning around for another reason. Wife's Disaster Manual. When the forsaken city starts to burn, after the men and children have fled, stand still, silent as prey, and slowly turn back. Behold the curse. Stay and mourn the collapsing doorways, the unbroken bread in the forsaken city starting to burn. Don't flinch. Don't join in. Resist the righteous scurry, and instead stand still, silent as prey. Slowly turn your thoughts away from escape. The iron gates unlatched, the responsibilities shed. When the forsaken city starts to burn, surrender to your calling. Show concern for those who remain. Come to a dead standstill. Silent as prey, slowly turn into something essential. Learn the names of the fallen. Refuse to run ahead. when the forsaken city starts to burn. Stand still and silent. Pray. Return. Throughout the book, I was interested in thinking about how the language of war and violence really sort of permeates our language in the most kind of mundane language that we might not, we've sort of become almost inured to it. So I thought, well, what's the language that we're sort of most inured to? And that's the idiom, right? It's the language that we, and so I thought, well, let me turn to idioms that include body parts and see what happens. A show of hands. My father taught me never to show my hand. Always play the hand you're dealt. Don't bite the hand that feeds. You gotta hand it to him. He lived his life hand to mouth. Even before Nam, he knew close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades go hand to hand combat. Idle hands are the devil's. Play into the enemy's. Hand it over and out of his hands. Ringing, a bird in hand is worth two. In the bush, he wasn't so good with his hands. Took his life into his own blood on his hands, on the one hand, and on the other. The book includes poems that look at sort of more broadly the, the era, you know, what was happening around war and violence in 1970. And I cheat a little bit because I include a poem from December of 1969, and it is about the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago by the Chicago police and the state. It's called Lightning, and it is for Deborah Johnson, who was Fred Hampton's partner, who was in the bed in the apartment with him when the apartment was shot through. Lightning, Chicago, Illinois, December 4th, 1969, for Deborah Johnson. You didn't look down or back. Spent the fractured minutes studying each crease and curve of the law men's faces, so that later you could tell how it happened, how you crossed over his body, how you kept your hands up, how you didn't reach for anything, not your opened robe, nothing. How they said he's good and dead. How you crossed over the threshold. How you lifted one and then the other slippered foot across the ice. How you kept yourself from falling. How your bared belly bore the revolver's burrowing snout. How when the baby starts to descend, it's called lightning, though it feels like a weight you cannot bear. Lightning is when you know it won't be long before it's over. I forgot to mention she was 8 months pregnant when this happened. Key detail. I don't have photos for every one of them, okay? I'll just leave it on there. There are a number of self-portraits in the book, and this is one of them. It's a sonnet called Self-Portrait with Weeping Women. I know why I fell hard for Hecuba. Shins skinned and lips split to blooming lupin on her throat's rough coat. Hurl down the whole length of disaster. I'm sure I'd grown to know by then to slacken as a sail against the current and squall of a woman's woe. What could I do but chorus my ruddered howl to hers? When you're a brown girl raised up near the river, there's always a woman bereft and bank-wrecked, bloodied and bleeding her insistent lament. Ah, Llorona, every crossing is a tomb and a tune, a wolf wail, and the moon that turns me to scratch at the tracks of every mud-dirged girl. In the second half of the book, in the middle section of the book, I actually reckon very explicitly with a very famous poem, a famous photograph called Napalm Girl, right, which is actually a photograph of a very important photograph from the war, and I speak in the poems to the person in that photograph, and then I move in this last section of the book, which is where these next two poems will come from, to kind of expand the parameters in terms of time, and I kind of move forward. I finished the book in 2018, which was another year of the dog by accident, and it kind of moves forward in time to think about the long reach of the war. So this is one of those poems that takes place in 1982, a year of the dog, and the year, importantly, that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was being constructed. And so this poem's called Year of the Dog, Walls and Mirrors. It takes place in fall of 1982 and begins with a quote by Maya Lin, the amazing designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And in the quote, she says, "The wall dematerializes as a form and allows the name to become the object." The English translation of my surname is Walls, misspelled. The original S turned to its mirrored twin, the Z, the beginning of the sound for sleep. It's 1982, and I'm nearly 12, and the mirror is a disaster I learned to turn away from. The girl looking back, always looking to extract her pound of flesh. I had a simple impulse to cut into the earth, Maya Lin is writing, as the mirrored wall of names she's made is arranged and laid against the riven hillside. I never looked at the memorial as a wall, she writes, but as an edge to the earth, an opened side. For a wall to become a mirror, it must not absorb or scatter too much light. For a girl to become the protagonist, she must sleep with the guy, or until he kisses her awake. Sometimes we know she's the fairest one of all because of the mirror on the wall. Sometimes she must scale the city's walls to bury the guy. Antigone cuts into the earth to give him his proper memorial. She ends up the heroine and buried alive, an in-between thing, like someone who's 11 or nearly 12. When I look at the number 11, I see two walls, my name and its mirrored twin. Sometimes 11 resembles the mirrored L's at the end of wall or the beginning of llanto, the Spanish word for weeping. Sometimes 11 looks like a pair of railway sleepers arranged and laid along a track that's always leading me back to my war-worn father. Sometimes the guy comes back from battle and has seizures in his sleep and the girl must shake him awake. Sometimes the girl and the name are one and the same. Sometimes the wall is where we end up to begin letting go our llanto. Do I have time for one more? Or not? You can tell me no. Pardon me, 1 minute? Yeah. I don't know if I can do this. You know what? I'm actually gonna just read a very short one then. Okay, and I will end with another self-portrait that is one of the last poems in the book. Again, in 2018, when I was writing this, I was writing it in the spring of 2018, and by then, that year had had the most amount of school shootings in the history of the United States. So I was very much in that space with a young daughter. And so this is called Self-Portrait in the Time of Disaster. All morning, my daughter pleading, outside, outside. By noon, I kneel to button her coat, tie the scarf to keep her hood in place. This is her first snow, so she strains against the ritual, spooked silent, then whining, restless under each buffeting layer, uncertain how to settle into this leashing. I manage at last to tunnel her hands into mittens, and she barks and won't stop barking. Her hands suddenly pause. She's reduced to another state, barking all day in these restraints. For days after, she howls into her hands, the only way she knows now to tell me how she wants out. Thank you so much.
It's a stunning, harrowing reading, Deborah. Thank you. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be reading here for the Dean Echenberg reading series. My first time in Austin. I love it. Thank you to Erica, Cheryl, Grace, and everyone at the Ransom Center for doing all that you do and for facilitating this. Of course, to my fellow poet, sister poet in war poetry or poetry that's grappling with a legacy. And I should also want to say thank you to the veterans of war and veterans of peace. I thought I would read just a selection of maybe 5 poems from my first book, Reenactments. And the title, to give you a sense of where that's coming from, I will hopefully talk about this a bit more later, but an idea of poetry as reenactment of war memory and also other kinds of experience. I encountered a really important photographer for me, An-mi Lei, who these photographs of Vietnam War reenactors in the forests of Virginia, and she sort of embeds herself as a photographer, as a reenactor with a 19th century Dearborn camera. So when I saw those, I kind of had a metaphor or a way into thinking about my own poetry as a form of reenactment. So the first couple poems I'll read are ekphrastic poems that are responding to her photographs. Small Wars. It was my turn to play dead, so I zipped up my flight suit and monkeyed into the cockpit. Larry, Tobias, and Tim formed the commando unit. Alfredo got the shaft again and played Charlie all by himself. Wasting no time, they slipped back into the woods like ghost soldiers and waited for the signal. Sunlight bombed the forest floor. I pulled the pin on the smoke grenade, tossed it under a tremendous wing, then slumped over my aircraft like a limp rag doll. In minutes, the shooting began. All hell broke loose as planned. Someone sprayed blanks into the enemy trees, laying cover for the others. I could hear the branches and twigs snapping under the boots of my rescuers. Someone radioed for helicopters and phantom jets that would never materialize. Pine cones dropped from great invisible heights. Black smoke seeped into my eyes, and blood rushed to my head and dangling arms. A giant cicada singed the air with its emergency song, "Too late, too late." When I came to, the stars in my jungle burned like sodium flares. I was going to project a photo, but that photo is of a phantom, actually a prowler attack jet in the forest, and someone is actually sort of playing dead in the cockpit, and there are these reenactors surrounding the rescue scene. And so I was trying to write into that character. And this one, also a ekphrastic poem, but moving around different photos, more from the perspective of, I guess, another reenactor, but talking about the photographer who's joining the reenactments. A brief history of reenactment. On day 1, the photographer walks into camp and immediately starts shooting. She shoots us at breakfast eating our sea rations, in our hammocks reading Stars and Stripes. She shoots us in her sleep. When we first cross paths at the creek, she says, "Hello, tiger. Nice combat boots. Is that thing real?" pointing to my Special Forces jungle shirt. "I'm afraid so," I say nonchalantly, trying to mask my satisfaction. Day 2. No more messing around. The photographer has agreed to join the action. So, what's the scenario? A lone guerrilla left over in a booby-trapped village jumps out of a hidey hole and ambushes the platoon on a search and destroy. Good thing I brought my black pajamas and sandals. What a trooper. She also plays the captured prisoner, the native informant, and the beautiful turncoat. The sniper girl is her favorite role because it's like taking pictures. The beauty, her voice volleys spookily from behind some rocks as she picks off one of my men after another. Sometimes the photographer shoots herself. I know she has her own personal baggage. Later, I find her sobbing in the bamboo grove. I tell her, it's okay. These wars only last 3 days. What will you do when it's over? She asks. I don't know, I say. Plan the next one. On day 3, after another routine patrol, we sit together on my favorite log in the shade of oaks and devise more scenarios. The topo map unfolds across our laps like a magic carpet. She's got killer bangs above camera eyes. I mark all the dangers and landing zones. She speaks of controlled light and the hole that opens up when you press the shutter button. At 2400, our hands nearly touch. There was a meteor shower. I call in mortar fire. And since we're at this beautiful library and archive full of books, I wanted to read a couple poems that deal with found things and try to be in conversation with Deborah's work on the second hand. But I was shopping in Madison for Christmas, as one does, a secondhand shop, trying to find something. But I came across this Vietnamese phrase book that was published by the Department of the Army. It was like 1962, a little, sort of like a Lonely Planet travel guide, except for soldiers. And it kind of freaked me out, but it was also really interesting. So this is all found language as I was flipping through that phrase book. So all the language is from this book. Initial Encounter with Locals, Vietnamese phrase book, Department of the Army, pamphlet, 1962. 1. Enter the village alone. The password is. Each individual must know these passwords. Select the most able-bodied messengers. Promise, hurry, swear. We'll wait. All of you will wait. 2. Come with me to the orchard. Don't be afraid. We are friends. Have a cigarette. Are you afraid? Why? Of whom? What? You certainly read our leaflets. 3. What is the name of that mountain? Which color is the most recognizable from a distance? From what spot could I have a better view? What are the usual questions? Who usually comes to this forest? 4. We cannot see from here what we wish to observe. We need an open place, a meadow, field, plateau. It must be far away. Do you know of any such place? We will pay for everything. 5. point on the map. We will call it the drop zone. Take care of this map. We cannot give you another. Here's my watch. When shall we see you again? Good luck. So that was a little pamphlet I found in a thrift store. There was also flying the NVA flag. This was Madison, Wisconsin. And this next poem, a little longer, a really central poem to this collection. I'm a professor of English, and some of you all have used the Norton Anthology to teach. Maybe you all are familiar with the Norton Anthology, writing marginalia. Anyways, my folks, we resettled as refugees to Wisconsin. I grew up there in 1982 and onwards. Then my parents got sick of the winters and retired down to Georgia. But on one of my breaks, they just asked me to come look at the books. Which ones should we keep? Which ones should we haul off to half price, etc.? And I stumbled across my father's old sort of literary textbook, full of his marginalia. And since he's always a good student, he had very good commentary on marginalia. So this poem owes a lot to my father being a good, diligent student and reading. My Father's Norton Introduction to Literature, 3rd edition, 1981. Certain words give him trouble. Cannibals, puzzles, sob, bosom, martyr, deteriorate, shake, astonishes, vexed, ode. These he looks up and studiously annotates in Vietnamese. Ravish means whoop dak. Shits is like when you have to di-ia. Mourners are those whom we say are full of buong rao. For even the like precurse of feared events, think bao juk. Its thin, translucent pages are webbed with his marginalia, graphite ghosts of a living hand, and the notes often sound just like him. All depend on how look at thing he pencils after I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. His slanted handwriting is generally small but firm and clear. His pencil is a number 2, his preferred highlighter, Arctic blue. I can see my father trying out the tools of literary analysis. He identifies the turning point of the short and happy life of Francis Macomber, underlines the simile in both the old man and the child stared ahead as if they were awaiting an apparition. My father, as he reads, continues to notice relevant passages and to register significant reactions, but increasingly sorts out his ideas in English, shaking off those Vietnamese glosses. 1981 was the same year we vượt biển and came to America, where my father took intro lit for fun, comp sci for job. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening, he murmurs something about the dark side of life, how awful it can be, as I begin to track silence and signal to a cold source. Reading Ransom's Bells for John Whiteside's Daughter, a poem about a young girl's death, as my father notes, how could he not have been vexed at her brown study lying so primly propped? Since he never properly observed, I realize this just now, his own daughter's wake. Lấy làm ngạc nhiên về is what it means to be astonished. Her name was Dom Sua, ancient winter, but at home she's Bebe. There was such speed in her little body and such lightness in her footfall, it is no wonder her brown study astonishes us all. In the photo of her that hangs in my parents' house, she is always 14 months old and staring into the future. in re-education camp, he had to believe she was alive because my mother on visits took arms against her shadow. Did the memory of those days sweep over him like a leaf storm from the pages of a forgotten autumn? Lost in the margins, I'm reading the way I discourage my students from reading. But this is how we deal with death, his black pen replies. Assume there is a reason for everything, instructs a green asterisk. Then, between pages 896 and 897, opened to Stevens's Sunday Morning, I pick out a newspaper clipping, small as a stamp, an old listing from the 404 Employment Ops, state of Minnesota, and read, for current job opportunities, dial 612-297-3180. Answered 24 hours. When I dial, the automated female voice on the other end informs me I have reached a non-working number. So I let myself be very professorial in that poem. It's good to give yourself permission. I'll read another family familial poem, and I was thinking about photography and media, and we're just sort of, it's Thanksgiving, it's another November, except we're in Wisconsin, my sister's house, and watching a movie called World War Z, and this poem is for my sister Kinnick. Remember when Dad said he killed zombies for a living? Thanksgiving, we were all downstairs watching World War Z. Brad Pitt, you know him, he's the movie star. I should have. We were all downstairs watching World War Z. Brad Pitt stabbing every undead soul with the kitchen knife he had duct taped to the end of a shotgun as he led his family to the tenement rooftop in Newark, where, of course, a helicopter awaited. Outside, trees stood sentry, and winter threatened to launch its first assault on our nights and days, while another city succumbed on the plasma screen, and death was figured as an unwanted rebirth. Which is when Dad deadpanned the thing about killing zombies at work, and we laughed in the dark, not knowing what a botnet was. Shortly after, you were the first to go, though you lasted longer than anyone expected, lumbering back upstairs to sleep just before a tidal wave amazed the walls of Jerusalem, aided by computer-generated imagery of the different shapes a crowd can take: pyramid, tentacle, wave. The world, for the most part, resembled ours. After all, ours is an age of extremity, zombie sci-fi reflecting and allaying our worldwide anxiety. Or so Susan Sontag would say, whom I refrained from quoting because I anticipated your eyes rolling. There he goes again. You also missed Mom's live commentary on the chaotic scene at the besieged airport. She said it was just like Saigon, April 1975, the runway swarming with desperate bodies, the improbable escape on the last flight out. It must have happened in ultra-high definition, those final days before they were Mom and Dad. The movie family was reunited in Nova Scotia, svelte in parkas and ready to face the sequel. That was November 2013. We were at your house in Madison celebrating Thanksgiving early. Another war was on. You were about to be a mother and slept for a generation. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Grab my notes here. Thank you so much, Hai-Dang. I'm so excited to have this opportunity for us to talk, particularly because we were speaking before and we had a similar experience reading each other's books, which was feeling this real sense of almost siblingness in our poetry as children of war, right? And what that means, and the particular challenges of writing as the child of the generation that actually experienced the war, but experiencing its sort of radial effects in the afterwards. And so I'm wondering maybe if we could start by, talking about what it means to write, or what the challenges or the possibilities were for each of us about, Marianne Hirsch talks about like post-memory, right? Speaking about the generation that didn't experience it firsthand, but definitely lived with various traumas and silences that happen afterwards. So I don't know if you wanted to start us off?
And I just want to echo that sentiment. When I was reading Deborah's work, it did feel like I was encountering an older sister who had gone through it, or there was a kind of familial recognition of some of the work you were doing, and also a very sort of distinct way of getting at that work. I guess for me, like reenactments came out of both a need to figure out how to write in the aftermath, to write about war, but not feeling like I had I didn't experience it. I don't have sort of the first-hand memories, but it was in the house, and it was in the silences. It was just the way that we interacted as family, and so I was trying to figure out how to write, maybe not as a war poetry, but like after-war poetry. And so when I saw I was struggling with this, but when I saw An My Lei's photographs, this Vietnamese American photographer, like in the deciduous forests of Virginia with reenactors, Vietnam War reenactors with the on-spec kind of camouflage gear, and I could recognize some of the military paraphernalia. When I saw her do that, I was like, oh, okay, this is a way in. I really wanted. I felt like I couldn't write about it, but her work showed me that I could use like distance, generational distance to my like advantage, as opposed to like a liability, like, oh, I can't write about this. I didn't experience it, and yet I'm experiencing some of its aftermaths. So reenactment was one way to kind of learn from the past, as your work does, to kind of try to reckon with both the national cultural inheritance of all the spectacle of violence, the news photos, and then the more invisible, marginal sort of stories through family and other forms.
Yeah, I was really taken by your use of that idea of reenactment, right? Because in so many ways, like what happens for the child, is that reenactment of those traumas, or the sort of presence of whatever the war is carrying forward. So it's a great way, I think, a way in, like you said. The photographs allowed that for you, but also as a metaphor, I think it resonated with me as someone who, grew up with someone who served in Vietnam. The school district where my father went to school in the west side of San Antonio had the second highest number of casualties in Vietnam, second only to a school district outside of Philadelphia, which was predominantly black. And so, my father, as this working class immigrant, Mexican American, being sort of, going off to war, I think when he returned, I tell the story, he was worked in a dental unit, so he spent his life kind of like looking into the dark caves of mouths, and then came home and kept his closed for 40 years. And I think for me, the presence of that silence, you know, and I know we're going to talk about silence, but that presence of that silence that just took up so much space was absolutely the reason I turned to words, you know? And so I think that, you know, and I think other poets have talked about, Salman Sharif and others, about, you know, while I may have never been to war, it's been in my life, my whole life, you know? And I think for me, it wasn't like my father's story I'm telling, right? But it was my story in relation to that father. And so, although I show his face in the photos here, one way I wanted to sort of honor that distance, right, and that thing that, of course, I can never know the experience in some ways, was all of the photos in the book, none of them show his face. And I wanted that, even though he gave me permission to use the photos, and we had, you know, by the time I wrote the book, while he still wasn't really talking about the war, he did allow for that, you know. But he was honored. But I wanted to preserve, one, his own privacy, and also to sort of really suggest the ways that, like, there is no way I could fully capture, right? That there is still that elusiveness to his experience that I cannot know, that I am in fact representing, again, my own relation to this.
I've found both the counter narrative of the family photos that you include really powerful, but I was curious why you sort of, what led you to sort of put those together and rub them together, as you put it? Was it, there's so many compositional questions I have about your book, and there's so varied forms, but a lot of it is sort of like these images rubbing against each other and words and fragments. But did you start with photos and then move to the words, or was there a kind of back and forth?
Yeah, you know, so I guess chronologically you could say I started with photos because there was such silence about the war growing up. I used to sneak into my dad's office. I used to say, like, you know, sometimes people would sneak into their dad's rooms to, like, look at illicit magazines. But I would actually sneak in to look at his photo album from Vietnam. And I didn't know why. I was totally obsessed with these photos. But, I mean, I look back, I can see why, right? I was trying to figure out why there was this oppressive silence in the house and volatility at times that sort of seemed to be like a landmine. You didn't know where to step. And so I think, in some ways, the photos did start it off for me, but I was a kid, I didn't know that that's where it would lead. So that I'd written about him in Vietnam before, and I kept saying to myself, okay, I'm done with writing about this, come on, move on, you know, you're almost 50, like, you know, write about something else. And it wasn't finished with me, and I realized it was, that the way to reckon was to return to the photos. And of course, to me, it made sense because, you know, as I said before, you can't really, it's so hard to imagine that war without summoning those images, right? Pulitzer Prize winning images of the war. And yet, as hyper visible as they make that war, and as important a role as they played in the ending of the American presence in that war, they obscure so much, right? Any photograph, right? What's outside the frame, and documenting Latinos in Vietnam, even though they were serving in such high proportion, they're actually very difficult in terms of the archive to document because they were classified as white racially. And so the way that people have tried to kind of figure out how to count them was to go by Spanish surname, but that of course doesn't always account for things. So they elude the archive. And so I thought, well, I have these photos. What happens if I sort of trouble the existing archive with his archive as this archive of Mexican-American presence there? Yeah. And your work with the photographer, I think we're both invested in the ekphrastic. How for you aside from what you've mentioned already?
Some of it's just pure unoriginality. Like, you know, so I'm not a fiction writer, I can't make up stuff, so the photo is sort of like, oh, I'm interested in this, I'm fascinated by this, and I can interact with it. So some of it is, I say that in jest, like not being original, but also I think like being the generation after, or as immigrants, and sort of the sense that, like, you have it good, you won't understand what we went through, which I think also tracks with the kind of way of talking about war veteran experience of the critic Paul Fussell talks something about like combat Gnosticism, and there's like a kind of, this sort of knowledge and experience only a select group of people can know. And sometimes I get that with people, family, my parents who've gone through things, and they will say things like, you'll never understand, or, and it's hurting, and there's a kind of recognition there, but on the other hand, I'm like, well, I'm trying to understand like the after effects of that. So yeah, some of it is giving ourselves permission to wade into that to that work. I was back to the Edgewood neighborhood. Part of what you were saying is, and part of what we're inheriting as Americans and our cultural memory of a kind of, certain news photos. And I grew up watching Vietnam War movies, and sort of most of the casts are mostly white, but white and black, and so like the brown sort of Mexican American sort of presence in those are not there, So, so on the one hand, the sort of invisibility of certain veterans, contrasting that with, I don't know, the ways in which right now there's a kind of hyper-visibility of, people in America. And so I really appreciated and found that your work profound in making your father as proxy to other Mexican American sort of war experiences more visible, audible, but that tension between keeping something private too, I was fascinated with. So like why the faces come up, there's, his face is not in any of the photos. And I'm sort of curious how you came to that decision, what it led to your own sort of series of self-portraits, which are kind of your own face.
Right. Yeah. I can wrap this up, and then we can open it for questions. I think that for me, working with the fragment it was really important, right, to really get at the sort of partiality of what I was capturing, right? That as much as my dad is a stand-in, and as much as the poems themselves might not be working always with fragment themselves, but wanting the image to show, no matter what I write and no matter how, I feel like I've crafted the perfect, villanelle or whatever it is, that the photos are a constant reminder that I'm never, that I can. It's a story is partial in all senses of the word, right? And so I think that was really an important way for me to honor the relationship and to honor the ongoing kind of absences of that story being told. Yeah, meaning Latino presence in the war. Because Latinos, right? We're hyper visible when right now, and that's dangerous. So it's not like visibility is the answer always either. And so I really wanted to sort of mark that.
But it was wonderful to see his
it was.
face in photos.
There is one photo of him that I did do an essay with. But I think we can open it up at this moment to questions. If there are questions from the audience, we'd love to hear. Yes, Steve.
So thank you both very, very much. I'm interested in, how personal the poems that you both shared are, but how much a collective experience of Vietnam was to all of us, and how the personal contributes to that collective, and does the poetry at some point become the collective? I'm interested in that dialogue between the private and the personal and the collective experience.
One way I've been thinking about it, this has been I haven't read from this book in a while, and sort of returning to it. There's a way in which the war history, what we what we frame as a national history is like just another way to try to understand a family history. Like, so what was kind of weird is like I'm no expert of Vietnam War, but it just seemed to be part of like a family history, and that's what I was trying to get at. It just happened to be that like, you know, what brought my very being in Wisconsin, growing up there, was a result of particular American policies and war and like all of that. But it was central to that was just was the personal, and trying to understand, you know, family, and in the context of a much larger, much more complicated history, culture.
Yeah, we talked about the sort of movement between lyric and epic registers.
Yeah.
But I think that I so agree with that idea that, right, to talk about these family histories, right, is always to then, you know, the frame has to be wider, right? Because we can't, you know, I can't talk about my father, you know, eating his avocado sandwiches and living off of barely nothing growing up, you know, without it being about Vietnam, right? In some ways, I think that that's part of it. And for me, I think because it's the daughter's story, I couldn't tell that story, the personal story, without also connecting it to this larger tradition of women who have been invested in sort of not shutting up about it, you know, and sort of howling and howling and howling about it. So for me, the way I tried to manage that was the movement between the personal and the more mythic, I think also was helpful for me.
And you bring it into the present too, and with the school, like national school
Yeah,
shootings, and I think that's really important. Another way to thinking about your question was, I didn't read, you know, the poems I read were very centered on maybe Vietnam, but there are poems in here that are trying to, you know, not only remember the present, but remember the past, but remember the present. Poems about Syrian refugees, and, you know, this sort of recursus of history within a very different context. And so part of the struggle is like both having an allegiance to like the family memory, but then as second generation, as maybe using our distance, our critical and creative distance to be autonomous, to maybe actually not passively inherit these stories, push back, connect them to other struggles for freedom, other histories of refugee flight.
Other questions? Great, we'll go here and then here. Oh, is that Jen?
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. I love these two books so much, and putting them in conversation is just making my brain and heart so happy. It's so exciting. So all these thoughts are in my head. So this isn't a fully formed question, but one thing that I noticed in both your readings is that you're using so many other voices. Dad, you have violin, you have your dad's voice, and there's marginalia, and you have your dad's marginalia too high, as well as that weird guidebook. And so I'm just really curious about that kind of intertextuality, but also that polyvocality, and as like a poetic technique, as a way of writing history that decenters authority, but also as a kind of ethic and politics. So, it's a big question all over the place. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about writing in this manner, where you are kind of letting other voices and putting yours on the side and creating other kinds of distances, to use your word, Hai.
I think for me, you know, I learned so much from, you know, the tradition of, you know, Black American poetry, and that idea of like the collective autobiography, or the sort of idea of the singular always in a kind of dialectical relationship to the collective, which speaks back to your question, Steve. And I think for me, that polyvocality, right, is as you say, a politics, right? That it is about really trying to decenter the idea of a singular story about Vietnam, which was so just overdetermined, right? Whether it's about Apocalypse Now, or whether it's, you know, about, you know, an image of Kim Phuc in, you know, in Nick Ut's photo of the napalm. And so I think that that for me was important. So bringing in, whether it's the mythic voices or bringing in actual, like you said, other kinds of texts, found text or others was part of it for me, I think important to that. I don't know, how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all of that. And it was the first book, and I was trying to figure out how to approach
Yes.
approach things. It felt like a reenactment of, okay, how do I write about this similar subject through different angles and perspectives? And so, I mean, poetry has that capacity, right? The lyric poem, whether it's the first person I, that kind of slippery second person you, and sliding into persona. And so I think I was starting to write a first book, and I was like, okay, what can poetry, poetic forms, poetic techniques, what can I draw on from that resource that's different from photos or movies, which have their own incredible sort of technical devices. So for poetry, for me, it's different forms of like human voicing, a kind of trace of language, and trying to enact or reenact like thought, thinking, or feeling through different perspectives. And so I think we're up against like a just a huge, massive amount of Vietnam War representation. So what can poetry still do?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I don't know if we had time for one more. Do we have time? Yes, please.
More of a comment
Sure.
than a question. And I wanted to tell you about my collection and how it evolved. And when I got back from Vietnam, it was pretty clear poetry that I was starting to collect, and it sort of branched out to war poets, the people, the combatants of the First World War, and then it sort of grew from there. And I had to make, it ended up with over 7,000 books, and so I had to define it somehow. And I'm so glad that you're here, because you're part of the definition that evolved as I collected. And I always was people who experienced war, men, women, or children. And the point that I want to make is that you are, in a sense, war poets because of what you absorbed from your parents' participation and experience in the war. And so you're writing war poetry, by my definition, are in my collection. And that's why I just wanted to bring that up. So
Thank you so much. And
the
thank you for
children
making
of
this
participants is something, and there are many poets of that ilk.
Thank you.
Especially after the second book, Children of Combatants, to an extent. So I'm very glad.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
having
Dean.
us. Thank you. I think we are done with time, but happy to take questions off stage if folks have any. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here.